They told her the stone would be the worst part, that the Obsidian Alpha's body had been turning for 20 years, skin hardening and cracking in a slow, grinding cycle that left his flesh split along black-veined seams no healer dared touch. They said the sound alone was unbearable, a low, deep grinding, like a mountain slowly tearing itself apart from the inside. That wolves with iron stomachs had gone pale at the cathedral threshold and never returned. That the pack had stopped sending anyone at all. So when they chose a sacrifice, they chose the one no one would miss. They chose her. When Silas's guards shoved the heavy cathedral doors open and gestured Lillian inside, she had already pressed the small square of lavender cloth against her nose. Her fingers were white-knuckled around it. Her bare feet found cold stone. Her stomach had been braced since the moment Silas had looked at her, not with cruelty in his eyes, but with something far worse: calculation. She had expected the smell of rot, of something ancient and decaying, something that matched the warnings they had whispered in her ear the entire journey here, as if preparing her for a death she was supposed to accept quietly, like a good omega, like a useful tool that had finally found its purpose. But the smell never came. Lillian stood at the threshold of the ruined cathedral and breathed in nothing but cool air, sharp with ozone and ancient earth, the way the sky smells just before lightning splits it open. The lavender cloth hovered uselessly at her face. Her stomach, braced for an assault that did not arrive, slowly unknotted itself into something far more dangerous: curiosity. The cathedral was vast and broken and breathtaking all at once. Moonlight poured through a great rose window above the altar, its stained glass still impossibly intact, a riot of deep violet, amber, and fractured blue that scattered color across the stone floor like fallen jewels. The pillars on either side rose into shadow, their carved surfaces dense with wolves mid-howl, mid-run, mid-transformation, frozen in the stone as if they had been caught in the act of becoming something. Ember-red sparks drifted like lazy fireflies near the floor, throwing just enough light to make the dark pulse with warmth. And at the far end of it all, on a throne that had grown from the cathedral floor rather than been placed upon it, a mass of raw rock and twisted ancient root, sat the Obsidian Alpha, Enrique Marrero. The rumors had built him into something shapeless and monstrous, something between a corpse and a catastrophe, a creature so far gone into his affliction that nothing human remained, just stone and suffering, and a slow, grinding end that everyone was simply waiting to finish. The rumors had not prepared her for this. He was enormous. Even seated, even half-consumed, he commanded the room the way a cliff face commands a shoreline, immovable, fundamental, something the world simply organized itself around. His shoulders were broad and bare, the muscle beneath his remaining skin dense with the kind of strength that did not come from training, but from endurance, from 20 years of holding a body together through sheer, grinding will. His dark hair fell loose to his jaw. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths, as if each one was a choice he made consciously, carefully, refusing to stop. But the stone, it had taken his left side almost entirely. Black-veined obsidian crept from his left hand up the full length of his arm, branching across his chest and shoulder like the roots of a dead tree drawn in ink and shadow. Where the stone met his living skin, it glowed, a deep, internal amber heat, like coal that had not yet gone fully cold, pulsing faintly with each breath he drew. Thin cracks ran along its surface, not breaking, just aching, as if whatever was inside was still pressing outwards, still fighting. And his face was still sharp, still his, a jaw set hard against a pain he would not voice, dark brows drawn low, and his eyes were the thing that stopped her breath entirely. They were human, fully, completely, devastatingly human, dark as deep water, and burning with an intelligence the stone had not touched. Not the eyes of a monster, not the eyes of a mindless curse made flesh. The eyes of a man who had been enduring something unendurable for 20 years and had simply, quietly, stubbornly refused to stop. Those eyes found her now, crossing the cathedral floor with the slow, certain weight of a king who had once commanded thousands and had not forgotten how, even here, even like this. They narrowed, not with hunger, not with the feral vacancy the pack had promised her, with suspicion, with the careful, exhausted wariness of someone who had been betrayed enough times to recognize the shape of it before it arrived. His voice, when it came, was low, rough at its edges, scraped raw by years of disuse. But beneath the damage, the authority remained, deep and resonant and undeniable, filling the cathedral the way thunder fills a valley. "Who sent you?" Not a question, a verdict waiting to be handed down. Lillian's fingers loosened around the lavender cloth. It fell. It landed on the cold cathedral floor without a sound, and she did not reach for it, because she understood, standing there in her tattered cream linen dress, with her bare feet on ancient stone, and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She understood that she had been sent here to die quietly, and that this man, this king half-eaten by stone and abandoned by the world, was supposed to be the instrument of her erasure. And instead, she was looking at him, and he was looking back. And something in the air between them, sharp with ozone, humming with a warmth she could not name, felt less like a death sentence and far more like the first breath of something that had been waiting a very long time to begin. This story belongs to every soul who has ever been handed to a monster and discovered, upon arrival, that the real monster was the one who sent them. If Lillian's courage moved something in you, if you felt the weight of that cathedral floor beneath your own feet, you already know what kind of reader you are. You're one of us. Drop a wolf emoji in the comments if you felt that moment when the lavender cloth fell. Tell me, would you have stayed or would you have run? I want to know your heart. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because this pack doesn't leave its own behind, and the next chapter will not wait for stragglers. What Lillian discovers in that cathedral will change everything you think you know about sacrifice, power, and who was truly cursed all along. The Shadow Crest is waking up. Stay close. It had not always been a cathedral that smelled of ozone and ember light. Once, Lillian's world had smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, of her mother's hair and the particular warmth of a hearth that belonged to her. Once, she had believed, the way young wolves believe, with their whole chest, that the mate bond was sacred, that the moon herself had chosen, that being chosen meant being safe. She had been 19 when she first felt it. The pull, the warm, certain thread that tied itself around her sternum and said, him. Silas Thorne, Alpha of the Blood Moon Pack, broad-shouldered and silver-tongued, with a smile that knew exactly how much it was worth. She had been grateful. That was the part that still burned the worst, the gratitude. She had been grateful, and he had known it, and he had let her remain grateful for 3 years while he quietly decided what she was worth in a different kind of currency entirely. The pack had gathered in the great hall on a night that smelled like the last edge of winter, cold still in the air, but the ground beginning to soften, the way it does when something is about to change and the earth knows it first. Silas had stood at the head of the long stone table with his silver-plated armor gleaming and his hands clasped behind his back, and he had looked at Lillian the way a merchant looks at a ledger entry he has finally found a use for.
"The Shadow Crest territory," he had said to the assembled pack, his voice carrying the easy authority of a man who has never once doubted his own right to the room, "has been vacant and unclaimed for 2 decades. Its lands are rich, its ancient bloodlines, if extinguished, leave no heir to contest ownership." He had paused there, let it settle. The Obsidian Alpha still breathes, barely. He is stone more than man now, and what remains of his mind is not fit for governance. Another pause. His eyes had moved to Lillian only once, briefly, with the dispassion of someone checking that a tool was still in its place. "We will send him a gift, a sacrifice in the old tradition. The act will be recorded as an offering of good faith. The Alpha's death will follow naturally, and the Blood Moon Pack will inherit what is owed to us." What is owed to us? As if the Shadow Crest land had always been a debt waiting to be collected. As if 20 years of another man's agony were simply an inconvenience standing between Silas and a property line. Lillian had not spoken. Not because she lacked words, she had them, a lifetime of them, pressed flat and quiet by years of being the Omega in a room full of people who had decided her rank before she opened her mouth. She had not spoken because the mate bond was still there, fraying at its edges now, pulled taut with something that felt like a rope being wound around a hook, deliberate, mechanical, and she had understood, in the particular clarity that arrives just before a very bad thing happens, that he was about to sever it. He did it without ceremony, without meeting her eyes. He spoke the words of the old dissolution rite the way you'd cancel a contract, efficiently, without sentiment, and the bond had not so much broken as unwound, thread by thread, each one snapping back into her chest like a struck wire. It hurt the way structural damage hurts, not sharp, deep, the kind of pain that doesn't announce itself at the surface but reorganizes everything beneath it. When it was done, Silas had looked at the pack, not at her, and said, "She is released from our bond so that she may serve the pack in a higher purpose. Her gift to the cursed Alpha will ensure our prosperity." The pack had been quiet. Not the quiet of objection, the quiet of people who had already weighed the cost and decided it was not theirs to pay. Lillian's mother, Arya, had been in the 3rd row. She had found her face in the crowd and held it for as long as she was allowed to. Her mother's weathered features, her kind eyes wet at the edges, her mouth pressed into a line so tight it had gone white. Arya had reached out one hand briefly toward her daughter. The guards had moved Lillian toward the cathedral door before she could reach back.
The memory released her the way deep water releases a stone, slowly, then all at once. And she was standing again in the cathedral with the lavender cloth on the floor and the ozone in the air and Enrique Marrero's dark, burning eyes fixed on her face. She realized she had been holding her breath. She let it go. "My name is Lillian Vigna," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected, perhaps because she had nothing left to lose that hadn't already been taken from her tonight. "I was sent by Silas Thorne, Alpha of the Blood Moon Pack." She paused, then added because it felt important to say it plainly. "He told his pack I was a gift. He told me nothing at all." Enrique did not move. The amber pulse within the obsidian along his arm beat its slow, aching rhythm. His jaw tightened, a small, almost imperceptible clench, as if the name Silas Thorne had landed somewhere specific and tender. "Then Silas Thorne," he said, each word ground out with the careful precision of someone who has taught themselves to speak through pain, "has sent you here to die. I know. And yet you are still standing in my cathedral." "I am." The dark eyes narrowed again, and this time there was something in them that was not quite suspicion anymore, something that hadn't yet decided what it was.
He turned his face slightly away from her, toward the high rose window where the moonlight fell in its colored fragments, and the motion exposed more of his left side, the full, terrible geography of the obsidian rot, black veins branching across his ribs, his chest, creeping along the side of his throat toward his jaw. Where it ended and living skin began, that amber heat pulsed, restless and imprisoned, like something that had been trying to get out for 20 years. "Leave," he said, quieter now, not commanding, almost something else. "There is a path through the eastern ruins. If you move before dawn, the wraiths won't track you. Go back to whatever is left of your life." Lillian looked at him for a long moment. "And leave you here?" "I have been here for 20 years. The words were flat, but something underneath them was not. But that was not quite true, and they both knew it, because the amber pulse in the stone had brightened fractionally since she stepped into the cathedral, as if something in the room had been adjusted, as if a dial had been turned very slightly toward warmth. "Your eyes are still human." She went very still. "They told us you were mindless," she continued, and she took one step forward, then another, her bare feet soundless on the cathedral stone. "They said there was nothing left of you, that you were stone and instinct and a slow death. They said that so we wouldn't think of you as a person." She stopped about 10 feet from the base of his throne, close enough to see the fine detail of the obsidian surface, the way it caught the rose window light and fractured it into something almost beautiful. "But your eyes are still human. You are still thinking. You are still here." Enrique's gaze had come back to her face. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something ancient in it, something that had been a long time without being seen correctly. "What I am," he said very quietly, "is dangerous. I know that too." She took the last few steps and reached out her hand.
She had not planned it. That was the honest truth of it. She had not arrived at the cathedral with a strategy or a theory or any reason to believe that touching him would accomplish anything beyond confirming that Obsidian was cold and unyielding. Her body had simply made the decision before her mind had finished its debate, the way bodies sometimes do when something deep and instinctual recognizes what the rational mind is still arguing about. Her fingertips made contact with the obsidian along his forearm. The world cracked open. Not violently, not explosively. The way ice cracks in early spring, a sound like a held breath finally released. The obsidian beneath her touch split along a thin, clean line, and from within that split came light. Warm, amber bold, the precise color of sunlight through old honey. And beneath the split stone, where the crack widened just enough to reveal what was underneath, skin. Living, warm, human skin, flushed with blood and heat, impossibly intact. Lillian's breath caught. Enrique had gone absolutely rigid. Every muscle in his remaining living shoulder and chest had locked, his jaw clamped so hard she could see the tendons along his neck standing out like cables. Not in pain, or not only in pain, in something larger than pain. In the shock of a man who had stopped expecting anything from the world except continuation of its cruelty, suddenly encountering something it had no category for. He looked down at his arm, at the crack in the obsidian, at the golden light still glowing faintly where her fingers rested against the stone, at the small, impossible window of living skin. The sound that came from him was not language. It was barely sound at all, just a low, fractured exhale, rough-edged and involuntary, the sound of something breaking open in a way that had nothing to do with stone. "What are you?" he said, and it was not the earlier demand, not the king's interrogation, clipped and wary. It was quieter, stunned, naked in a way that the rest of him was not. Lillian did not remove her hand. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I think I'm supposed to be here." She heard the door before she heard the footsteps, a low, deliberate creak of ancient hinges, Controlled, not accidental. Someone who had opened that door 1,000 times and knew exactly how much sound it made. She turned. The figure from the cathedral entrance had moved inside. In the rose window light, she could see him properly now. Tall, lean, wearing a long, dark traveling coat that had accumulated years of road dust along its hem. His face was sharp-featured and deeply tired, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for so long they've forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Her eyes, she noticed, had the faintest red luminescence at their edges, subtle enough to miss if you weren't looking, unmistakable once you saw it. He stopped a careful distance from both of them and inclined his head, not at Lillian, but at Enrique first, a beta acknowledging his alpha. Old form, deep loyalty, the kind that did not require performance. "She needs to know," he said. His voice was low and careful, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering information that changes things. Enrique's jaw tightened. "Kaelin." "She touched the stone and it cracked," Kaelin said, and something in the way he said it, the weight of held breath finally released, 20 years of waiting pressed into 6 words, silenced whatever objection was forming. "My lord, she touched the stone and it cracked. She needs to know what that means." A long silence. The amber pulse in the obsidian beat its patient rhythm. Then Enrique turned his face toward the rose window again and said nothing, which Lillian was beginning to understand was his way of giving permission. Kaelin turned to her. "The obsidian rot," he said, "did not come from the gods. It did not come from a battlefield curse or a sorcerer's hex. It came from a poison, slow-acting, mineral-based, administered in small doses over years until it reached critical accumulation in the bloodstream. The first doses were given to Enrique's father. By the time it surfaced in Enrique, it had been in the bloodline for a generation. By then, the families who administered it, and I will not say their names yet, but you already know at least one of them, had been waiting for the throne to empty for long enough that they had built entire political structures around its vacancy." Lillian was very still. The single crack in the obsidian still glowed faintly between them. "There is no natural cure," Kaelin continued. "The poison is mineral in nature. It responds to and feeds on the same elements that compose the stone itself. Every healer we have brought here has carried conventional remedies, herbs, blood magic, lunar rites." A pause, brief and careful. Some of them were genuine. They failed because they were using biological tools against a geological problem. His red-edged eyes moved to Lillian's hand, still resting against Enrique's arm. "The only catalyst that can complete the reversal cycle is not a remedy. It is a frequency, a specific resonance that disrupts the mineral chain at its molecular level and allows the host's own body to expel the stone from within." He looked at her directly. "We call it soul light. It is extraordinarily rare. It presents as a genetic inheritance, specifically in bloodlines with seer ancestry. And it is," he said with the quiet gravity of a man stating a thing he has staked 20 years of his life on, exactly what just cracked that stone. Lillian looked down at her hand, at the warm light still breathing softly from the fracture beneath her fingers. "I'm an Omega," she said, not argumentatively, just placing it on the table. The fact as she had always been given it, the ceiling she had always been told was the floor. "You are what the Blood Moon Pack told you you were," Kaelin said, and his voice was not unkind. "Those are not the same thing." The rose window scattered its violet and amber light across the cathedral floor. Somewhere deep in the stone pillars, something shifted, not structurally, not audibly, but perceptibly, the way a room shifts when something in it changes, as if the cathedral itself had been listening and had registered what had just been said. Enrique had not spoken through any of this, but Lillian could feel, without looking at him, that he was watching her, with that same expression she couldn't fully name, the one that had been a long time without being seen correctly. She found the evidence 3 days later, and she nearly missed it. She had been moving through the cathedral's side passages, the small stone corridors that connected the main nave to the older vestibule chambers, where Kaelin had told her previous healers had kept their supplies. She had gone looking for anything useful, manuscripts, old records, anything that might tell her more about the soul light lineage Kaelin had described. She had not been looking for anything suspicious. She had not known yet to look. The satchel was behind a fallen pillar fragment in the second vestibule, pushed into the shadow and covered with a length of dark cloth that matched the stone well enough to be invisible unless you moved it. She moved it. Inside the satchel were 4 glass vials, each sealed with wax. The liquid inside was not quite a liquid. It shifted between states as she tilted the vials, sometimes flowing, sometimes settling in a fine crystalline suspension. Silver. Not the metallic kind, not weapon-grade silver. Mineral silver, ground to a powder fine enough to be dissolved in water, fine enough to be administered invisibly in a drink or inhaled from a diffused cloth, fine enough to never be identified as anything but dust. Her photographic memory had its uses. She had looked once, briefly, at a manuscript Kaelin kept in the eastern alcove, a dense handwritten account of the Obsidian rot's properties. She had not studied it, she had simply seen it, and it had stored itself the way everything did, perfect and indexed. She retrieved it now. Silver in mineral solution acts as an accelerant to the obsidian compound. Administered in incremental doses, it will increase the rate of petrification by a factor of 3 to 5, depending on the subject's existing resistance. In a host already carrying advanced stage rot, a single sustained course of silver mineral exposure will suppress the body's remaining ability to fight the compound entirely, resulting in full and irreversible petrification within... She stopped reading. She stood in the vestibule with the satchel in her hands, and the vials cool against her fingers, and the smell of ozone in the air around her. And she understood with the flat, nauseating clarity of someone who has just seen something they cannot unsee, exactly what Silas Thorne's healers had been delivering. They had not been trying to help Enrique. They had been finishing what the poison had started. Every healer Silas had sent, and she already knew, from the careful, broken way Kaelin had spoken of failed remedies and genuine failures, had been carrying this, incremental courses of silver mineral solution, each one tightening the stone's grip, each one eroding what remained of Enrique's ability to resist, delivered under the guise of compassion, wrapped in the language of healing. She thought of Silas at the head of his long stone table, his hands clasped behind his back, his voice carrying across the great hall with its easy authority. The Obsidian Alpha still breathes, barely. He knew exactly why, because he had been ensuring it.
Her hands were very steady. That surprised her. She had expected them to shake. But something had happened in the 3 days since she had walked into this cathedral on bare feet with a lavender cloth pressed to her face and a life that had been quietly confiscated from her piece by piece. Something had shifted at a structural level, the way the cathedral shifted when a truth was spoken into it. She felt it in her sternum, where the mate bond used to be. Not the grief of its absence now, but something filling the space it had left. Something that did not feel like grief at all. She put the satchel under her arm and walked back toward the nave. Enrique was where she had left him, where he was always. The throne, the stone, the patient amber pulse of something that had been enduring so long it had forgotten that endurance was not the same as living. Kaelin stood near the eastern wall, watching the door the way he always watched the door, with the focused stillness of a man who has been standing guard for 2 decades and sees no reason to stop now. Both of them looked at her when she entered. She set the satchel on the cathedral floor at the base of the throne steps. She set it down carefully, deliberately, the way you set down something that changes the terms of a conversation. "Your healers," she said, looking up at Enrique, "were not healers." He looked at the satchel, then at her face. Something moved through his eyes.
Not surprise. Confirmation of a fear too old and too worn to produce shock anymore. The look of a man who had suspected, in the private hours of the stone, that even the mercy being shown to him was a blade pointed inward, and who had kept that suspicion to himself for so long it had become part of his architecture. Kalen crossed the floor in 4 long strides and crouched over the satchel, examining the vials without touching them. The red at the edges of his eyes deepened. His jaw worked silently for a moment. "Silver mineral compound," Kalen said. "Accelerant," Lillian confirmed. A silence. Long and weighted, and full of the particular quality of rage that has nowhere immediate to go. The cold kind, the kind that does not burst but calcifies, settling into the bones as purpose. "How long?" Enrique said. His voice was very quiet. "I don't know when it started, but the last healer Silas sent was 6 months ago." Lillian paused. "Which means 6 months ago, someone stood in this cathedral, looked at what you are enduring, and chose to make it worse." She held his gaze. "Let it sit between them, plain and undeniable. He doesn't want your land after you die, Enrique. He has been engineering your death. There is a difference." The amber pulse in the obsidian beat twice, 3 times. The crack she had made with her touch was still there, hairline fine and glowing, a small, stubborn window of warm skin in all that black stone. Enrique looked at it. Then he looked at her, this woman who had arrived as a sacrifice and had not left, who had put her bare feet on his cold stone floor and refused every invitation to escape, who had just carried evidence of a 20-year conspiracy across his cathedral and laid it at his feet, not with performance or demand, but with the simple, direct manner of someone who has decided that the truth is more important than her own safety. "Why?" he said, and the word was stripped down to its essential weight. "Are you still here?" Lillian held his gaze steadily. "Because someone should have been here a long time ago, and wasn't. And I am not going to be one more person who leaves you alone in this." The rose window scattered its ancient light across the stone floor. In the pillars around them, something breathed. The stained glass had been trying to tell her something since the first night. She had noticed it the way she noticed everything, completely, involuntarily, her memory photographing it before her conscious mind had decided whether it was relevant. The rose window above the altar was not decorative. She understood that now, standing in the gray pre-dawn light of the 4th morning with a manuscript open across her forearms and the cathedral quiet around her except for the slow, patient rhythm of Enrique's throne from his throne. The window was a diagram. It had taken her 3 days of cross-referencing, the manuscript Kalen kept in the eastern alcove, the secondary text she had found pressed flat between 2 fallen stones near the vestibule, and the window itself, which she had memorized panel by panel from floor level, and then reconstructed internally, rotating and layering until the geometry of it resolved into something deliberate. The outer ring depicted the lunar cycle in deep violet glass. The middle ring showed a figure, female, arms extended, light radiating from the palms, positioned at each of the 8 phases. The innermost ring was the one that had taken her longest to read, because it was not imagery, it was notation. A ritual sequence, rendered in the symbolic language of the old seer orders, compressed into colored glass by someone who had known, centuries ago, that the obsidian rot would come, and that the window might be all that survived to guide whoever came after. The manuscripts filled in with the glass compressed. The soul light, she read, was not transmitted through touch alone. Touch was the activation, the initial fracture, the proof of resonance. But the full reversal cycle required something more permanent, a binding agent, something that could carry the soul light frequency into the bloodstream of the afflicted host and sustain it from within, continuing the mineral disruption even when the seer was not in direct contact. Something that already carried the seer's frequency at its most concentrated. Her blood. She stood with that knowledge for a long time in the gray pre-dawn quiet, with the rose window beginning to catch the earliest edge of morning light and scatter it in fragments across the stone floor. It was not a frightening realization. That surprised her. She had expected fear, or at minimum hesitation. What she felt instead was the particular stillness of a puzzle completing itself, of scattered pieces finally declaring their arrangement. She had been brought here as a sacrifice. The word had always implied that something of hers would be taken. It had not occurred to Silas or to anyone who had designed her erasure that the thing taken might be given willingly, on her own terms, for her own reasons, in a direction entirely opposite to the one intended. She closed the manuscript. She crossed the cathedral floor to where Enrique sat in his eternal vigil of endurance, the amber pulse in the obsidian marking time like a second heartbeat that had never been allowed to rest. He was awake. He was always awake, she had learned. Sleep was difficult when the stone tightened through the night, contracting with the cold and releasing with the warmth, a constant low-grade grinding that she suspected he had stopped registering as pain years ago, simply because registering it would have made it impossible to continue. He watched her approach with those dark, burning eyes that had not once in 4 days looked at her with anything less than full attention. It's not a frightening realization. That surprised her. She had expected fear, or at minimum hesitation. What she felt instead was the particular stillness of a puzzle completing itself, of scattered pieces finally declaring their arrangement. She had been brought here as a sacrifice. The word had always implied that something of hers would be taken. It had not occurred to Silas or to anyone who had designed her erasure that the thing taken might be given willingly, on her own terms, for her own reasons, in a direction entirely opposite to the one intended. She closed the manuscript. She crossed the cathedral floor to where Enrique sat in his eternal vigil of endurance, the amber pulse in the obsidian marking time like a second heartbeat that had never been allowed to rest. He was awake. He was always awake, she had learned. Sleep was difficult when the stone tightened through the night, contracting with the cold and releasing with the warmth, a constant low-grade grinding that she suspected he had stopped registering as pain years ago, simply because registering it would have made it impossible to continue. He watched her approach with those dark, burning eyes that had not once in 4 days looked at her with anything less than full attention.
"You're not taking it," Lillian said. "I'm offering it. There is a difference." She paused. Then, "You said that to me once. About the land. About Silas. You said there was a difference." She held his gaze. "I'm returning it." Another silence. Longer. The amber pulse beat its slow rhythm. Then Kalen's voice came quietly from the eastern wall, where he had been listening without pretending not to. "My lord, she has already decided. I can see it in her. Let her." Enrique looked at Lillian for a long, searching moment, the look of a man taking a precise inventory of something he is afraid to need. Then he turned his face toward the rose window and said nothing. She took his hand. What followed was not dramatic the way the first touch had been dramatic. The crack of stone, the shock of light, the stunned exhale of a man encountering the impossible. What followed was quieter and harder and more sustained than that. It was a vigil. Lillian stayed. That was the whole of it, and it was everything. She stayed through the days when the obsidian seemed to fight back, when the amber cracks she opened each morning had narrowed again by evening, the stone reasserting itself as the silver mineral residue in his bloodstream pushed back against her light. She stayed through the nights when Enrique's breathing changed, went shallow and labored,
and she would press her palm flat against the warmest section of the stone and hold the frequency steady through sheer concentration until it evened out again. She stayed through the morning of the 6th day when he told her, in a voice stripped down to its structural minimum, that she should save herself the effort, that 20 years was too long, that some stones did not crack. "Then we'll find out together," she said, and did not move her hand. She had made a small incision on the 7th day, clean, deliberate. The ritual sequence from the manuscript followed precisely, and pressed it to the largest fracture line along his arm. The effect was not immediate. It was a process, mineral against mineral, her frequency working through his bloodstream like a slow tide. But the stone did not reclose over the fractures after that. They held. They widened incrementally, 1 millimeter at a time, the amber light deepening from a coal glow to something closer to sunrise. By the end of the first week, his left hand had emerged entirely. Large, strong-boned, the skin unmarked beneath, impossibly, perfectly intact, as if the stone had been a casing rather than a wound, preserving what was inside it rather than destroying it. Enrique had looked at his own hand for a very long time without speaking. On the 9th day, he spoke to her without her asking him a question first. Small things, initially. The name of the cathedral, which was older than the Pax system and had been built by the first Shadowcrest Alpha as a place for the Pax dead to be honored. The names carved on the pillars were not decorative, but memorial. Every wolf whose spirit remained in the stone waiting for their alpha to wake. He told her these things in the careful, tentative way of someone relearning that their voice was allowed to take up space, that speaking into a room did not require the cost of being there. By the 2nd week, he was describing things she hadn't asked about at all. His pack before the rot, the territory's river valleys in autumn, a particular lookout point on the eastern ridge where on clear nights you could see 3 pack borders at once. He told her these things in the quiet hours before dawn when the cathedral was at its stillest, and Lillian sat close enough to maintain contact with the receding stone and listened with her full attention and understood that this was its own kind of healing, perhaps the more essential kind. His true form emerged like a coastline emerges from fog, gradually, then with sudden startling clarity. The broad shoulders she had glimpsed in silhouette on the first night resolved into their full geography, powerful and dense with strength that was structural rather than performed, the kind built by endurance rather than ambition. His jaw sharpened as the stone released it. His posture changed, still careful, still held against pain, but with the quality of a man beginning to remember what it felt like to occupy his body rather than simply survive inside it. He was, Lillian thought on the morning of the 13th day, watching him turn his newly freed left arm in the rose window light with an expression of quiet, private wonder. He was the most singular person she had ever been in a room with. Not because of his size, or his lineage, or the ancient authority that clung to him like a second skin, because of what it took to remain himself through 20 years of being slowly consumed, and to still be looking at the light with something that had not given up on being moved by it. She did not say this out loud, but he looked at her as if she had. The breach came on the 14th night. She heard it before she saw it, a change in the quality of the darkness outside the cathedral walls, the particular silence that is not silence at all, but the held breath of a large group of bodies moving with coordinated intent. Kalen was at the door in 3 strides, his eyes fully crimson now, his hand flat against the ancient wood. 12, he said quietly. Possibly more at the perimeter. Enrique had risen from the throne. Not all the way, the stone still held his right side from the hip down, rooting him to the rock, but the movement was seismic in its implication. He had not stood in 20 years. The effort of it was visible in every line of his body, but what was also visible, what was perhaps more visible, was that he was doing it, that the body which had been enduring in stillness for 2 decades remembered at its most fundamental level what it was built for. The cathedral doors opened. Silas Thorne walked through them the way he walked into every room, as if the space had been waiting to be completed by his presence. He was exactly as Lillian remembered, polished, silver-plated, constructed with the meticulous care of a man who understood that power was partly costuming. His fine coat was travel-dusty, but his posture was immaculate. 6 warriors flanked him, broad and armed, filling the cathedral entrance with the particular mass of people who have been told they will not need to be afraid tonight. His eyes found Lillian first, moved over her, the torn hem of her dress, her bare feet on the stone, her hand still resting against Enrique's arm, with an expression that cycled quickly through surprise, recalculation, and something that tried to become contempt, but did not quite complete the journey. Then his eyes moved to Enrique. Something shifted in Silas's face, small, quickly controlled, but Lillian had spent 3 years reading that face in the way that people read the faces of those they are afraid to misunderstand, and she caught it. The fraction of a second in which Silas Thorne registered that something had gone wrong with his calculations, and felt, briefly, the specific cold of a man whose plan has begun to come apart at a seam he didn't know was there. He recovered fast. He always recovered fast. Lillian, his voice was warm, practiced, the tone he used when he wanted something wrapped in the appearance of reasonableness. The sacrifice period has concluded. It's time to come home. This is my home, she said. She was surprised again by how steady her voice was. A brief pause. You are confused. You've been isolated here. Clearly the Alpha's condition has... His condition, Lillian said, which you have been actively worsening for years, is ending. She held Silas's gaze. I found the silver compound, Silas. All 4 vials. I know what your healers were carrying. The warmth in Silas's expression did not drop. It sharpened. The difference between a smile and the shape a mouth makes when deciding something. He turned his gaze to Enrique, slowly, deliberately, the way you turn to look at a problem you are about to resolve, and said, with a calm that was its own form of violence, "You should have stayed stone." He moved his hand to the silver blade at his hip. What happened next happened the way storms happen, not all at once, but in a sequence of pressures that made all at once feel inevitable. Silas drew the blade and moved toward Enrique with the efficient purpose of a man who has been waiting 20 years for this specific moment, and Lillian stepped in front of the blow. Not as strategy, not as calculation, as the simple absolute refusal of her body to allow one more thing to be taken from this cathedral without her standing between it and the door. The blade did not reach Enrique. What it reached was the soul light.
Contact with the silver, the same mineral family as the compound that had been slowly killing Enrique for 2 decades, detonated something in Lillian's frequency that neither she nor Kalen nor the ancient manuscripts had fully anticipated. The soul light did not flare. It did not pulse or brighten or behave with the controlled, directed warmth she had been channeling for 2 weeks. It erupted.
white gold and vast and resonant at a frequency that hit the stone floor of the cathedral and traveled outward through it the way a struck bell's note travels outward through the air, through the pillars, through the foundations, through every inch of the obsidian rot that remained in Enrique's body. Every fracture line she had opened over 14 days blazed simultaneously. The light did not consume. It resolved, the way a chord resolves, every dissonant note finding its correct position at once, the whole structure snapping into its intended form with a clarity that was almost musical. The obsidian shattered, not violently, all at once, from the inside out. Every piece of stone that had claimed Enrique over 20 years simply ceased, fell away, hit the cathedral floor in fragments that caught the light as they fell, and were still, and were nothing, and were over. Enrique stood, fully, freely, both feet on the stone floor for the first time in 20 years, his full height a fact that the cathedral seemed to have been built to accommodate, the alpha aura rolling off him in waves that had nothing performative about them. It was not the aura of a man asserting dominance, it was the aura of a man who had returned to himself, and it landed on everyone in the room with the weight of something geological. Silas's warriors took 3 steps backward without appearing to decide to. Silas himself held his ground, but his face had gone the color of old ash. Enrique did not look at Silas immediately. He looked at Lillian first, at her outstretched hand, the golden light still glowing from her palm like an ember that had become a sun. His dark eyes moved over her face with an expression she could finally name. It was not wonder, though it contained wonder. It was not gratitude, though it contained that too. It was recognition, the specific, devastating recognition of one person seeing another, correctly, completely, without the mediating filter of what either of them had been told they were. Then he turned to Silas. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The alpha aura did what voices attempt to do and rarely fully accomplish. It filled the room entirely, occupied every available register, left no frequency unaddressed. "You have been in my territory for the last time." What followed was brief. Silas's elite guard, 6 wolves chosen for their ferocity and their loyalty to their alpha's wealth, discovered in rapid and humbling succession that ferocity calibrated against a man half consumed by stone was a different and far less adequate instrument against a fully restored alpha, whose 20 years of endurance had not softened him, but compressed him, made him dense with a controlled power that his warriors, for all their training, had no framework to oppose. Kalen moved through the edges of the confrontation with a beta's precision, redirecting, containing, ensuring that the rout was complete and the damage was architectural rather than fatal. Silas ran. Not immediately, not without attempting one more recalculation, one more repositioning of his expression toward negotiation, but when Enrique took the first step toward him and the floor of the cathedral trembled slightly with the simple weight of it, Silas Thorne, Alpha of the Blood Moon Pack, assessed the distance between his ambition and his survival, and chose, as men like him always choose in the final moment, survival. He was gone before the last of his guard hit the stone floor. The cathedral was quiet. The rose window scattered its ancient light. In the pillars around them, something that had been waiting a very long time exhaled, a slow release of pressure, a settling. The carved wolves in the stone seemed to breathe differently. The ember sparks near the floor drifted upward instead of sideways, rising like the last of something that had finally been allowed to complete itself. Kalen, blood on his coat, breathing hard, looked at Enrique for a long moment with the expression of a man who has carried a thing so long he has forgotten what his arms feel like empty. Then he bent his head in a bow so deep and deliberate it was less a gesture than a statement, a lifetime of faith finally arriving at its vindication. Enrique named her queen in the cathedral, with Kalen as witness and the spirits in the stone as congregation. He did not do it with ceremony, not the formal ceremony, not yet. That would come later, in the full light of the Shadowcrest territory with the pack assembled and the old rites spoken correctly. This was different. This was the two of them in the rose window light, the cathedral floor still scattered with obsidian fragments that had once been his prison, and Enrique taking both of her hands in his left hand, newly returned to him, and his right, which had always been his own, and saying, with the directness of a man who had been stripped of everything but honesty and had never found a reason to pick up the alternatives, "You came here to die, and instead you gave me back my life. I will not diminish that by offering you a title." A pause. "What I am offering is a partnership. My territory, my pack, my name alongside yours, and every resource I have to reclaim what was taken from you." His dark eyes held hers. "Beginning with your mother." Lillian's throat tightened. She had not spoken of Aria since the first days, had kept her deliberately, painfully compartmentalized, because thinking of her mother in the Blood Moon pack, with Silas still in authority over her, was a door she could not afford to open while she was needed here. But the door opened now, and behind it was every version of Aria's face she had stored in her photographic memory. The kind eyes, the weathered features, the hand extended toward her daughter across a room that was already closing between them. "Yes," she said. It was the only word that mattered. They moved on the Blood Moon territory 2 days later. Enrique, Kalen, a small advance force of Shadowcrest wolves who had been waiting in the territory's outer regions, drawn back by the same resonance that had freed the cathedral spirits, their alphas return calling them home the way a tide is called by the moon. They did not need many. Silas had arrived back at his pack with a story that had not survived contact with the warriors who had been present at the cathedral, and who were, to a man, no longer willing to carry it. The Blood Moon pack opened their gates. Not enthusiastically, not unanimously. There were those who had benefited from Silas's order and were not glad to see it end, and there were those who had simply been afraid for long enough that fear had become their settled resting state. But there were more who had watched Lillian Vigna be handed to a monster and had said nothing, and who carried that silence in them the way you carry something that changes the quality of everything else, and who were, when it came to it, willing to do the harder thing. Silas Thorne was found in his great hall, seated at his long stone table, his fine coat still travel-dusty, his silver-plated armor on the table beside him as if he had taken it off and not yet decided what to do next. He looked, without the armor and the audience and the architecture of authority he had spent his life constructing, surprisingly small. He looked at Lillian when she entered, and for a moment his expression cycled through its familiar sequence, the recalculation, the repositioning, before arriving, finally, at something she had never seen on his face before, something that recognized it was finished. He did not speak. "Aria Vigna, tell me where she is." He told her. Aria was in the eastern quarters, unharmed. Silas had not touched her, whether from strategy or some residual constraint that even he had maintained. It did not matter. What mattered was the door opening and her mother's face turning toward her, and the particular sound Aria made, not quite a word, not quite a name, something more fundamental than either, when she saw her daughter standing in the doorway whole and steady and burning with a quiet light that had not been there before. Lillian crossed the room, and her mother held her, and she let herself be held, fully, without the managed distance she had kept between herself and her own relief for 14 days, and felt the last piece of something slot into its correct place. Silas Thorne was exiled before sundown, not killed. That had never been what Lillian wanted, and Enrique had not asked for it either. Execution would have made him a martyr, and martyrs complicate the work of rebuilding. Exile, with his crimes documented and distributed to every pack council within 3 territories, was a more complete erasure, not of his body, but his authority, which had always been the part that did the damage. He walked out of the Blood Moon gates with a single pack and no armor, and the gates closed behind him, and that was the end of him. The formal coronation happened at the cathedral, under the rose window, on the night of the full moon. The Shadowcrest pack filled the nave, not just the wolves who had gathered at the territory's edges in the weeks of Enrique's waking, but others who had heard and come, drawn by the thing that spreads faster than news through wolf communities, the sense that something has righted itself, that a wrong of long standing has been corrected, that it is safe now to come home. Kalen spoke the old rites. His voice did not shake, though his eyes were bright with the red luminescence fully surfaced, no longer held back or hidden. 20 years of vigilance finally permitted to simply be what it was. Enrique stood at the altar with his full height and his full presence and his full self, and none of it was armor. When he spoke the binding words and took Lillian's hands, his voice carried through the cathedral the way it carried on the first night she heard it, with the weight of something real, something that had not required an audience to become true. And what it carried now, added to the authority, was warmth. Lillian Vigna, who had been handed to a monster and had found instead a man who had refused to be one, who had walked into a ruined cathedral on bare feet with a lavender cloth she never needed and had stayed because someone should have, stood in the rose window light with her hands in his and felt, for the first time in her life, exactly as large as she was. Not an omega, not a sacrifice, not a tool shaped by the hands of people who needed her small. A seer, a queen, a woman who had walked into the dark willingly and had brought light in her hands all along without knowing it and had given it freely and had not been diminished by the giving. In the pillars around them, the carved wolves were still. The ember sparks had gone out. The spirits of the Shadowcrest dead, honored and released, were finally, fully at rest.